Well, good afternoon. My name is Jochum Wiersma, and I'm the Small Grains Extension Agronomist at the University of Minnesota. And like most years, either Jim Anderson or I give a variety update at Prairie Grains Conference, and I am very sorry that we all do this in this virtual environment rather than now being in Grand Forks. I'd much rather be there and actually talk to you in the hallways and after this talk than sitting behind my computer screen recording this presentation. I'll turn the video off now because really that isn't that the interesting part of this talk. So if we get into the variety update, um, like most years, it consists of three parts. We're going to look a little bit back over the past season. Um, we're going to look at the trial data, and then we're going to look at our picks. So if we look at 2020, and that slash maybe should be removed. It's been a weird year in more than one way because of COVID-19. But even in small grains, in the little world of small grains, things have not been all that kosher. Um, if we look at the state average in Minnesota, we only eked out 53 bushels to the acre. That again is 3 bushels less than the previous year. And that begs the question, are we in a downward trend or are we just stringing a bunch of bad luck years together? Now, in 2017, we shattered the state record at 67 bushels. Before that, we had reached a new record in 2015 at 60 bushels. And we'd been steadily climbing towards that 60 bushel in a relatively linear fashion since 1995. And so 2018 wasn't that far off the trend line, and even 2019 wasn't that far off the trend line. But we've now strung 3 years in a row with downward yields. And that, of course, is worrisome. Now, is it still bad luck? I think it is. At least I'm optimistic it is, because we again had a couple of things really not working in our favor. As we all recall, the fall of 2019 uh, was one to never remember. Unfortunately, it left us with a lot of acres that weren't worked, that hadn't been fertilized. And so, together with the very wet conditions and a relatively late start in the spring, we had a late start with the small grain seeding. Uh, really indicative of this is that all the beet acres had been planted in the Red River Valley before we really made a start on any of the small grains. The rest of the month of May really was below average for temperatures. And then the thermometer really ticked up quickly, even already in June. And so by beginning of July, the crop had mostly caught up. Now, that in of itself isn't the greatest worry for grain yield. It really is what the temperatures during grain fill that really determine how our crop, and how our yields will be. And unfortunately, like 2019, we had above average temperatures in July with especially much higher nighttime temperatures. You combine that with an area in northwest Minnesota that saw a tremendous amount of drown and flooding and just saturated fields that make that the crop is walking backwards, even if conditions had been favorable. Um, that together all made that we only eked out 53 bushels as a state average. Now, within that, there's probably more variability than most years, where we see very sharp dividing lines between, for instance, the north and the south, with lower yields in the south and on average higher yields in the north. This year, the individual fields and regions, the yields were all over. The highest yield that I've heard of was actually in Morris, where grower eked out 95 bushels in the acre, but that was planted very, very early, um, in the beginning of April, just as we had a little break in the weather in that area. Now, if we look at the new releases from the University of Minnesota, Linkert, which is now an older variety, still has 20% of the acres. And that's really the credit to Linkert's stability and, of course, its straw strength. Bolles has been declining since its peak in 2017. And that's really a function of Bolles probably not necessarily being overkill for grain quality, but Bolles really does not like heat during grain fill, and it suffers test weight under those conditions. Shelley was on par in 2019 in acreage with Balda as the two high-yielding varieties. Balda is maintaining its acres. Shelley is dropping in acreage. Part of that is probably straw strength. Lang also dropped in acreage, the 2017 release. Um, it's a little bit unfortunate because it's a really strong variety for both bacterial leaf streak and Fusarium head blight, but its Achilles heel is in this case also straw strength. Although we really have learned that when you lower the seeding rate to around 900,000 to 1,000,000 plants per acre, that Lang straw strength improves considerably and is on par with both Shelley and Balda, and we don't see the lodging problems, and that's especially important um, further north, but that's really a good recipe for the central part of Minnesota and even the southern part of the state. Washburn and Torgey are the newest releases, where Washburn now went to 4.4 acres, and of course there was very few acres of Torgey as it was the first year of release. If we look at the private industry and our surrounding state public programs, in total 9 releases came out. Each of them, most of them this year actually will be marketed under Title V of the PVP. Only TCG Wildcat will go the patent route as far as intellectual property right protection. It's a mixture of varieties. Note that AgriPro Syngenta is using now AP as a designation rather than SY. And my understanding is that in the coming years, AP will now precede all named varieties of AgriPro Syngenta rather than the SY. If we look at the variety survey, like I said, Linkert is still the largest variety. Valda is holding its own. And then Shelley dropped off to the number 5 spot. In between are two relatively, well, they had the same acres last year, but they gained some acres in comparison to Valda, and they probably took that away from Shelley mostly, and Mayville, 9590 and 9479. Now, last year, I couldn't talk about these varieties because we didn't have them in the yield trials. University of Minnesota's had a long-standing tradition that if a variety gets over 5% of the acreage, it enters into the state variety trials for free. And so 9590 and 9479 this year were in the trials, and so I have some data to share with you. And we can make some comparisons again between those varieties and the other varieties in the variety trial. Now, the trial data, we first have to talk about Fusarium head blight. Incidence and severity in the end of the season actually was less than I had anticipated based on the disease conditions and the risk models. And I think, and I'm pretty confident that is in part because you're choosing varieties that have ratings as 3s and 4s. It wasn't hard for me to find Fusarium head blight on susceptible varieties in the variety trials. Now, in addition to choosing those more resistant varieties with 3s and 4s, you combine that with fungicides and you have a good chance of having a marketable product. When you get into varieties that are on the right here, from basically 5, 6, and 7s and 8s, the problem with those varieties is that if we have light to moderate disease conditions, you more than likely will be able to make grade, which means less than 2 parts per million, bring into the elevator. If those varieties are a small fraction of what is being brought in, elevators have enough grain volume to be able to blend that away. If we get into conditions where we have, medium to very high disease pressure, then the varieties, even with 3s and 4s, with a combination of fungicides, are going to start showing here and there some DON content, especially if those infections occur late and we don't have an ability to remove the scabby kernels in the combine or in a quick clean scenario where we can get that lightest fraction, those really white scabby kernels, out of our grain. If those late infections indeed produce DON, and we see some light levels of disease in the more resistant varieties, that means that the more susceptibles are going to have definitely DON issues. That means then once you bring that grain, you're looking at discounts. The wheat quality survey showed that in 2019, where we only talked about Hagberg falling numbers, the average DON content was 1.8, just below the 2 part per million threshold. In 2019, luckily, that number went down to 1.2 parts per million. And I was a little surprised that it was actually, I figured it was going to be on par with 2019, given the conditions during the growing season. So FHB, even with fungicides, is still really should be part of your variety selection. The other disease that is getting more and more attention, in which we as breeders, Jim Anderson, Andrew Green, Carl Glover, are really starting to, and the privates as well, are really starting to pay attention to and selecting for or against bacterial leaf streak really hard in the breeding programs is bacterial leaf streak. We don't have control options, and we are really looking for indeed varieties that stay green. It is as simple as that. If they can maintain the canopy as long as possible during grain fill, is when we see the least amount of damage. We still might see some damage in certain environments under certain years if the disease shows up earlier, but on average, you are much better off with a 2 and a 3 for bacterial leaf streak, even if you had a history of bacterial leaf streak, compared to the 5, 6s, and 7s. Now, you see a couple of half ratings here, like the 2.5 and the 3.5. Those are actually ranges of ratings. They, in the variety trials book, because I wanted to use this color coding, I couldn't use the range that is here, and I believe the CP3903 is a 2 to 3 rating. Driver will have a 3 to 4 rating. That simply means, and the same is true for Fusarium head blight, that we don't have enough data collected yet to really pin down the variety. We see some variability in the data, and not until we have more environments are we going to pin that number down to either a 3 or a 4, or a 2 or a 3. Nevertheless, we have now in both Fusarium head blight and bacterial leaf streak a lot of options with really good resistance to these two diseases. Ingmar, Valda, Torgi, Washburn, Trigger are all varieties. Lang are all varieties that combine very good bacterial leaf streak resistance with very good Fusarium head blight resistance. Those two things, and then in the combination with some decent stem rust and leaf rust resistance, as well as some decent resistance to tan spot and septoria, means that you more than likely will only need a single fungicide application throughout the growing season. And that would be the application at Feeks 10.51, especially if the risk models start increasing to higher risk. Now, when we get into, of course, grain yield and grain protein, you've seen this slide before. On the bottom, you will always see the grain yield as a percent of the mean. I express yields always as a percent of the mean to really counter what we in breeding terms call the genotype by environment interaction, or the location or the year effect. It really is only to look, variety trials are really only to look as compare varieties amongst themselves. And as long as those differences stay consistent, they're useful for you. There's no need for you to stare blind at 100 bushels in a yield trial, simply because those are in many cases very nice locations within fields, and have inherently higher yield potential. Now, on the y-axis, for a couple of years now, I use grain protein yield. That is simply the function of the product of the actual grain yield multiplied by the percent of grain protein. This is analogous to sucrose per acre if you're a sugar beet grower. The big red line is 14% protein, and which is what the market wants. And what you can see is that the highest protein varieties, say bowls in the trial, isn't necessarily the one that produces the most protein on a per acre basis. In this case, the honor goes to 9590. This is the northern locations to 2020 data, which actually is only 3 sites. Sorry. That was a result of COVID, where we could only have one person in the combine. And normally we collect subsamples on which we determine grain protein on every single plot that we harvest. With only one person in the combine, that gets very tedious. And so we had to make some choices. And this data is Crookston, Hallock, and Fergus Falls combined. You also see that we have some really high yielding varieties like Trigger that really struggle to get to 14 Pro. They still produce a fair amount of grain protein. They just dilute it with a lot of starch. And then you have this middle cluster with Torgy, McLeod, Rebel, Murdoch, Heartland, Wildcat, Spitfire, Washburn, that are all kind of hanging out in the middle. And those are those balanced varieties that are neither fish nor fowl, if you are derogatory, but that are what in our world balanced varieties. They give not necessarily the highest yield, but they're not going to be very low protein because they just don't produce, they might produce the same amount of protein per acre, they just don't dilute it with as much starch. Now, if we look at the 3-year data, 9590, remember we had it in the trials in 2018, and so this is a statistical interpretation, but I think it's a very valid one. 9590, the reason it's being grown is this combination of grain yield and high protein, and it shows in this graph. Valda, prior to this, was really the variety that in a way was the top one when it came to nitrogen use efficiency and being able to produce the most protein on a per acre basis. 9479 has a little bit lower yield potential and is on par with Valda when it comes to protein per acre. The really high protein varieties, are Bowles and Mayville and Linkert. And you can see those, they're well above the 14 line. So the distance perpendicular off the line is how high the protein actually is. They are very high protein. Likewise, Trigger is very low protein. Uh, Varieties like Shelley, Prosper, Valda can reach that 14% in certain years and in certain fields, but it takes a little bit more effort. Trigger is a outlier all by itself, and we're going to come back to Trigger later in this presentation. Now, the second part that's important to you is how consistent are varieties across years, across location. Like I said, hindsight is 2020. Unfortunately, next year will not be like this year. And so we want varieties that have some predictability to them. And the way I present that is looking at how they did in an individual trial. I'm not looking at the absolute values. What I'm looking at is actually the rank. Remember, we have year effects. On average, yields will be higher or lower any given year. And that's just a year effect, whether we had a start late season or early season, those make differences. But if varieties still have the top rank every single time, I call that a very stable performer because it didn't flip flop around. Now, the thing with wheat is we have varieties and we make this choice between grain yield and grain protein. That was the previous slide. And so to compare apples to apples, I made this average rank calculation, and then I have the rank variance, and that's basically how varieties bounced around. If it went from first to last and back to first, and this is a mathematical calculation of how that bouncing is, it's called the variance of ranks, will be a high value. If it is always number one, there's going to be very little variance. So Trigger basically in 2020 was number one in every single, or number two in every single trial that in these 8 locations. Linkerd pretty much was always near the bottom. And in the middle, we have some varieties that show that they had a average rank, say 12 to 13th, but that they were always 12 and 13 because on average they had very little rank variance compared to Ranchero that came with an average rank of 13, but must have been in some locations much closer to Trigger and in some locations much closer to Linkerd. Now, to compare apples to apples, this blue line basically divides the data in half. So anything below the blue line in a group of varieties, say this balanced group of Shelley, Torgy, Rebel, Spitfire, Ambush, those varieties below the blue line are more stable performers than those above. Now, this is single year data, 8 locations. Of course, I like to sample years because year effects on average are larger than location effects in Northwest Minnesota. And so if you look at the 3-year data, things are starting to fall out the way, our guts tell us. Trigger, by far, right now, the highest yielding variety. Valda is one of the top varieties, and it's pretty consistent. Spitfire actually is consistent. Shelley is a little bit of surprise. That probably has to do with lodging. Prosper, we've seen bounce around a little bit, and that has to do probably also with a little bit of straw string, but more so probably susceptibility to stripe rust. Remember, all these trials that contribute this data in this data set do not receive a fungicide. Ingmar, Washburn are pretty consistent performers. Linkerd, Bowles are also, where Mayville is much more variable. Likewise, Barracuda, Chevelle, and Heartland are more variable, as is SY Longmire. It's a little hidden there. Granted, not every single variety is in here because to be able to do that, and for instance, none of the 2 Westbred numbers aren't in here because to be able to do this, I need to have every single variety, every single location that contributes to this data set. And that's what we call a balanced data set. I can't use statistical extrapolation to give it a rank in each of those locations, unfortunately. So the bottom line, if this year taught me anything again, I'm still a lousy meteorologist. All I know is that what the markets will pay a premium for is what I don't have in the bin. And so the hedging approach of mixing and matching is still pertinent. Um, Once your acre is above probably 500 plus acres, you really ought to um, have not just a single variety, but a couple varieties on your farm to basically hedge against high yield years with varieties that have a little bit more grain protein, and hedge against low yield, high protein years with having varieties that in those conditions will actually get very close to 14 protein, where in years where we have high yield, where they put more starch on, they would have a tough time getting maybe to 13.5% protein. So with that said, Jim and I maintain that Lang should be one of our picks, only at the lowest seeding rate, especially in Southern Min, because it has such a good reaction for bacterial leaf streak. It's a pretty consistent performer. It has very good Fusarium head blight resistance and is in that balanced category. The seeding rate we recommend is in that 1 million live seeds per acre of seedlings per acre, rather than the 1.25. So a 25 to 30% lower seeding rate works for Lang with very little yield penalty, but an improved lodging score that brings it on par with Valda and Shelley. We've added Trigger because it has exceptional yield, very good bacterial leaf streak, and Fusarium head blight ratings, but the struggle will be getting grain protein. As you go further south, that becomes less of an issue. Trigger is probably not a variety that should be your first choice if you farm along the Red River Valley in Kitson County. We know it's tougher to get grain protein there than it is if you are even in the Central Valley or the Southern Valley or in West Central Minnesota. We maintain Linkert in the lineup simply because of its straw strength. We know its weaknesses, and one of those is Fusarium head blight at just a 5 rating. We added Torgy as a variety that's maybe not the complete replacement for Shelley when it comes to yield potential, but it has yield. It has been pretty consistent in our trials, and it has much better bacterial leaf streak and Fusarium head blight ratings than Shelley. Likewise, we maintain Washburn in the list. It's going to be a little bit more towards a balanced variety, but has very good ratings for bacterial leaf streak and Fusarium head blight. And we maintain also Ingmar and Valda. And Valda's only Achilles heel, it's probably not, I wish actually it had slightly better straw strength, but in the larger scheme of things, it doesn't have the greatest milling and baking quality, which becomes an issue if there would be too much Valda acreage and we wouldn't have other higher quality wheats being blended away with it. We're near that point, and so in a way it's a somewhat of a mute point, but it's something that when you look at the quality, intrinsic quality of Valda for milling and baking, it is probably the weakest of the ones in this list. With that, I'll open it up for questions and hope to see you in next year at Prairie Grains rather than in this virtual format. Thank you.
Here we go. So, why do you look at protein yield per acre versus protein percent when plotting against grain yield?
Why I look at protein per acre basis, remember in those two slides, I always have the big red line. The big red line is what the market wants, but we manage acres, or we manage the crop on a per acre basis. And so the input that changes what we do with small grains and with wheat is nitrogen. Remember that all our trials have the same amount of N. And so I look at that as, in a way, some of the, like Bowles, basically doesn't need as much N in the trial. Variety like Trigger needed more N in that trial. So looking at protein grain yield, a protein yield on a per acre basis, as long as we remember that we have to hug that red line, allows us to actually compare varieties better, because it tells us which varieties will utilize the amount of N that is available better. And because we can't predict the weather for next season, and we know that basically varieties that have high protein are lazy for producing starch, um, it's a better way to, for me at least, to actually compare the varieties. If you always pick bowls or very high protein varieties, you're basically letting too many bushels go. And we are competing for acres. That's a long answer to a simple question, but does it make sense?
Yes, thank you so much. Got a few more for you here. In 2019, the West bred varieties had low falling numbers. Any comments on that?
Um, it's a combination. The ratings for 9590 and 9479, I believe, for pre-harvest sprout, which is the best indicator, actually, pre-harvest sprout tolerance is the best indicator whether or not you're going to have problems with Hagbrook falling numbers. And I showed that in presentations last year. I think the final rating right now is a 2, which I wouldn't have expected given the results in 2019. But I have to remind myself that when you, even if you, when you have scab in seed lots, you have starch damage. And that actually might contribute a little bit. And I have to do a little bit of literature research on that. But I was looking at the data yesterday and trying to indeed wrap my mind around the 2019 data with Hagbrook falling numbers and 9590 and 9479. I have to go back in the literature to actually see if scabby kernels had an influence on Hagbrook falling numbers. And I believe somewhere deep back in my brain that that is the case, and that might be part of the explanation. Now that right away, I'll jump into, because I see the question, Mark Mering asking why 9590 really isn't one of my picks or Jim Anderson's pick. And the answer is rather simple, even though I pointed out that it is the winner on that grain yield and grain protein plot. Its ratings for Fusarium head blight and bacterial leaf streak are a 7 and a 6 respectively, and that puts it in the right side column rather than the left side column, and into the red zone basically when it comes to variety selection.
Thank you so much. Could you compare the quality of Avalda and Trigger?
Not off the top of my head. I don't have all the numbers right in front of me. If you want me to really dig deep in it, I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. What's your opinion of AP Murdoch?
We've had AP Murdoch in the trials 2 years. It both, Longmire and McLeod, what I've seen of it compared to Valda and Ingmar, are what I would consider more central North Dakota varieties. So far, I think Murdoch is a little bit more a variety that will probably fit in the eastern North Dakota and the Red River Valley. What I was surprised by as I looked at the ratings yesterday is that its scab rating is a 7, and that's a little bit of a surprise given the current track record with Syngenta's releases. Otherwise, it looks okay. Yield-wise, it's not going to beat Valda. It's going to probably beat Ingmar if you compare it to that. Give me one more year with 3 years of data, and I'll have a very definite answer.
Thank you for that. Do you have any updates on seed ratings from the last year or two?
I think that the nicest work that we've done on seeding rates in recent times is actually what Jay Stanley did with Joel Ransom and I. And basically we're abandoning in a way individual variety recommendations and basically looking at straw strength and basically yield potential, and that's much tied to planting date and area of the state. And so Torgy, I think, can get away with relatively low seeding rates, unlike Rolock, for instance, where we did have problems with tillering. And so what we really want to go towards is measuring how well varieties can tiller. Now, because of COVID-19, we had to shuttle that trial, but eventually I'd like to add that actually to or basically as one of the data columns in the variety trials bulletins. And that will then automatically put us in the decision tree for seeding rate recommendations.
Thank you for that. How about what are you seeing with ballistic?
Oh, I should pull up my PowerPoint. Right now, can I just abstain because I don't have the data in front of me? I just look at myself right now, which is very
No
boring.
worries.
Which is very boring, to be honest.
For sure.